Good morning, everyone, at the 2018 Napa Institute. This is George Weigel joining you by video. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but I wish everyone there a good week of learning and prayer and fellowship together. It's entirely appropriate that this 2018 edition of the Napa Institute is marking the 40th anniversary of the election of Pope St. John Paul II on October 16, 1978. That was a pivotal moment in the contemporary history of the Catholic Church. I think it comes into focus if we think a bit on this anniversary about how things were 40 years ago in 1978. The Church seemed to be a bit on its beam ends. There had been an enormous controversy over the 1968 encyclical Humanae Vitae, a subject I'm sure you'll be tackling during this week. The Church's attempt to find some sort of working relationship with communist regimes in Central and Eastern Europe, the so-called Vatican Ostpolitik, did not seem to be working very well at all. People weren't paying attention. Bishops imagined that young people were impossible to address with the message of the gospel or the teaching of the church. And then suddenly, what seemed to be an entirely new spirit was created on October 22nd, 1978, when this dynamic, vibrant, handsome, compelling 58-year-old Pole, Karol Wojtyła, who had taken the papal name John Paul II, celebrated his inaugural public mass as Pope in St. Peter's Square, and preached a homily that laid out two challenges, which I'm sure you all remember. First, he said many times, be not afraid. Do not be afraid. Don't be afraid of the modern world. Don't be afraid of engaging the modern world. And then the second challenge was closely connected to the first. Open the doors to Christ, because in Christ we find the answer to all of the turmoil, to all of the turbulence, to all of the questions and discontents of modern life, as indeed of life at any moment over the past 2,000 years. Over the next 26 years, John Paul II systematically falsified every one of those claims that people were making about the Catholic Church in 1978, that it didn't know how to address the late modern world, that it didn't know how to speak to young people, that it had nothing to say to the great questions of the age. The most obvious example of this successful challenge by John Paul II was his pivotal role in the collapse of European communism during the 1980s. And it's important to remember briefly on this anniversary just what happened there. It didn't happen through politics. It didn't happen through economics. It didn't happen through military confrontation. A revolution of conscience was launched in 1979 in Poland, in June 1979, during John Paul II's first papal pilgrimage to his homeland. And that revolution of conscience spread throughout Central and Eastern Europe over the next decade, eventually producing a different kind of political transformation. The nonviolent collapse of communism and the establishment of democratic societies and free economies throughout the old Warsaw Pact, the old satellites of the Soviet Union. But John Paul II also falsified those claims of Catholic irrelevance in a number of other ways. He knew that something had to be said to the cultural tsunami that was sweeping the Western world, known as the sexual revolution. And instead of repeating old formulas and old prohibitions, he put the entire discussion on a new basis by articulating over 5 years, between 1979 and 1984, this remarkable body of thought we call the Theology of the Body. Some of you will be pondering that. during this Napa Institute. Let me simply say here at the beginning that this is the most compelling address to the challenges posed by the sexual revolution that has been articulated by anyone in the Christian world. It says to the sexual revolution, frankly, we'll see you and raise you. Let's see who takes human embodiedness more seriously. Let's see who takes marital love more seriously. Let's see who takes the gift of self and the reception of that gift within faithful and committed marriage more seriously. John Paul II changed the terms, changed fundamentally the terms of the Catholic Church's engagement with the sexual revolution through the theology of the body, and we see the effects of that in a positive way throughout the Church today. The other thing I think seemed clear to many people 40 years ago and turned out to be not true at all was this question of the Church and young people, which the Synod of Bishops will be addressing, as you know, in October of this year. I think it's probably fair to say that in 1978, most bishops in the Western world thought young people simply lived on a different planet. They talked a different talk, they listened to a different music, they responded to different stimuli. They simply weren't interested in what the Church had to offer. And then comes this Pope who began his priestly life and ministry as a university chaplain, as someone doing retail evangelization, door by door, dormitory by dormitory, in Stalinist Poland in the late 1940s and early 1950s, building zones of freedom and communities of conversation among young people, many of whom went on to very distinguished careers, creating Christian community where none existed before. And then in 1984, John Paul II thought, that experience might have a universal application. And so he began floating with his collaborators the idea of an international Catholic youth festival built around young people and the Pope. And he was basically told, Your Holiness, you're nuts. This isn't going anywhere. They're just not interested. But he trusted his own experience. He trusted his own instincts. And then in Rome, in Buenos Aires, in Czestochowa, in Santiago de Compostela, in Denver, in Toronto, in Paris, all over the world, in Manila, John Paul II gathered around him millions of young people who wanted to hear the truth of Jesus Christ because they somehow understood and they somehow felt in this man, in John Paul II, that the truth of Jesus Christ would reveal to them the truth about themselves and the pathway to a happy, fulfilled, noble life. So all three of these charges that were being laid against the Church in 1978, that it had no impact in the world, that it had nothing to say to the most dramatic cultural change of our time, the sexual revolution, and that it was losing kids and had nothing to say to them, all of these proved false thanks to the extraordinary ministry and witness of John Paul II. So now we are 40 years after his election. What does all that mean for today? I'll simply leave you with this thought as you begin your exploration of his teaching, of his magisterium. If you look around the world church today, the living parts of the church are those that have embraced the teaching of John Paul II and his worthy successor, Benedict XVI, as the authentic interpretation of the Second Vatican Council. Those are the living parts of the church, whether we're talking about the Napa Institute or the church in Africa or the great parishes and dioceses around our country, the living religious orders, the seminaries that are full rather than empty, etc., etc. And if we look around the Catholic world at where the church seems to be dying or moribund, it's in those places where the failed project of Catholic light that John Paul II challenged so effectively over more than a quarter century is still trying to be implemented by people who somehow just didn't get the message that he was proclaiming for 26 and a half years. So the living parts of the church are the parts that have embraced the teaching of John Paul II. The dying parts of the church are those that rejected that and are still trying to make a kind of dumbed down, hollowed out Catholicism work. That, it seems to me, is the validation now, 40 years after his election, of the truth of what he taught. I wish you a good week of pondering those truths. Please keep me and my family and my work in your prayers, as all of you will be in mine. Have a great Napa Institute, and thank you for listening.